Hi, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. We're here today with Colin Woodard in conversation with Tom Gjelton about his new book, Union. Uh, Before we get started, I just want to go over some quick housekeeping notes. First of all, we really encourage everyone to ask a question today. The latter half of the event will be dedicated to your questions. In order to ask a question, there is a question and answer Q&A little widget at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and ask your question there. And the second thing I want to draw your attention to is in the chat, I've posted a link to purchase Colin's book. We really encourage everyone to do that. It'll be a great way to support our author and to also support Politics and Prose. And with that out of the way, it is my honor to introduce Colin Woodard. He is a writer, a historian, and an award-winning journalist. He is the author of American Character, The Lobster Coast, The Republic of Pirates, and Ocean's End. Today, he'll be discussing his new book, Union, which tells the story of the struggle to create a national myth for the United States, one that could hold its rival regional cultures together and forge for the first time an American nationhood. This afternoon, Colin will be joined in conversation with Tom Gjelton, the Religion and Belief Correspondent for National Public Radio News. So without any further ado, here are Colin and Tom.
Great, Tom. Thanks very much. I'll take it from here. Speaking of honors, it's a great honor for me to be able to moderate this conversation with my friend Colin Woodard. It's a terrific book. It'd be great if we could all meet in person, but I know at Politics and Prose you sometimes have standing room only audiences, and it can be hard to get in. So this way, one advantage is that we can include everybody. So Colin, let me just say, when I first saw your book, my immediate reaction was, what the hell? No table of contents, no chapter titles, something like 70 chapters. And you look at the first couple of pages and you wonder, what is this going to be about? But I actually found that approach really worked. It made your book all the more entertaining and compelling. These short, snappy chapters, kind of quick transitions from one story to another, gave it, I thought, a really compelling narrative rhythm, and sort of kept me engaged in the book right from the beginning to the end. So that's kind of an innovation. I'm curious, first of all, how you came up with that idea of no table of contents, no chapter titles.
I guess I didn't consciously think about the table of contents. With the chapter titles, I wanted it to move quickly. And the idea was, I'd written a previous book on history that used this telling of history through narrative and through the lives of the people who were driving the history, a book called Republic of Pirates, which was about Blackbeard and his pirate gang. And structurally, it's a quintuple biography with everyone's lives weaved together. And I found in doing that book that approach lets you discover history that other approaches would have you miss. The fact that you're required to understand these people's lives from inception on to when they become relevant, and also how they interacted, both what they bring to the table, what their own experiences were, and how their lives crossed, and how that changes history, leads you to ask, very different questions, and often to research in different corners than you would. And with this book, I knew I wanted to use the same approach because, this is about a very important topic, but one that can easily fall into abstraction. It's about an idea. Ideas are some of the most powerful forces in human society, but they're abstractions, right? They're ideas, they're just out there. And how it is that ideas that shape history and events, how they get conceived and by whom and why they conceive them that way, is often idiosyncratic about the person who put it together, who their family was, who their friends and allies were, who their enemies were, and then how an idea can somehow get out into the world to affect us all collectively, that it becomes part of our sort of collective subconscious. How does that happen? How did that happen before the internet? How did that happen in the early 19th century? And what happens when there's a clash of ideas where the stakes are absolutely enormous? And I knew the only way that you could tell this, both to understand the material, but also to make it compelling and real, was to try to tell it through this biographical approach. And so then it becomes a novelist approach where, having those numbers, you often see that in like a Stephen King novel or something where there are no chapter titles, it's going along in the weave of narrative. So I was borrowing from that. Eric Larson tells history often in that fashion, although he's usually not covering a century time frame, but rather a few years, but that pacing I realized works in narrative, which is how I
It totally worked. It totally worked. And I'll tell you, to me, the greatest achievement of your book, Colin, is that you're talking about, as you suggest here, an idea that is fairly dry and abstract, sort of the intellectual history of the concept of the American nationality, and yet you managed to make it a suspenseful story. So it was like, I was almost to the very end before I had any clue how you were going to sort of conclude this about, what was the guiding national myth. And to make a nonfiction history book like this suspenseful is not easy. Let me tell
Thank you. Yeah. There aren't very many historiographical thrillers, so thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, let's set the stage a little bit. So the subtitle is "The Struggle to Forge the Story of United States Nationhood." Let's take that last word, nationhood. The idea here, as I understand it, Colin, and you can elaborate on it, is sort of the notion of what America stands for. What does it mean? What does America mean? What does the American nationality mean? And I thought you set that up really well with a section right in the beginning of the book. And I wonder, we talked about this before, so you know what I'm talking about. I think it begins on page 4. If you could just read that, because I think that sort of sets what the stakes are around this story of America not knowing exactly what it was all about in the beginning.
Right.
Can you read that?
Yeah. Let me read that section right now. So this is taking place at the inception of the country in the end of the Revolutionary period. The revolution's been concluded. People are trying to write constitutions, the early republic and such, that we jump into this section. No one thought that they had created a nation state of the sort that Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France was, and that Central Europe's romantic thinkers hoped the states of the German Confederation might one day become. Its people lacked a shared history, religion, or ethnicity. They didn't speak a unique language all their own. They hadn't occupied the continent long enough to imagine it as a mythic homeland, a place their people had dwelled in since time immemorial, and they'd killed or supplanted those people who did have the right to make such a claim. They lacked a common political heritage, apart from the imperial ties against which they had just revolted, and they had no shared history of who they were and what their purpose was. In short, they had none of the practical or ideological formations and foundations of a nation state. The United States was a state in search of nationhood, a country in search of a story of its origins, identity, and purpose. It needed to find these things if it was to survive.
Colin, I think that will sort of surprise some people, because I think we've been led to believe from our history classes and our civics classes that we did have a sort of an idea right from the beginning. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, that laid out a really sort of inspiring vision that really no other country in the world was articulating at that time. I remember George Washington, in one of his, I think it was a speech to an immigrant community in New York, said, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions." And so, we've had this in the background. That hasn't there been this kind of notion of a really idealistic beginning from the beginning?
I mean, the Declaration was absolutely a statement of intent and purpose upon which the subsequent United States narrative of itself, or one of them, would be built. That's the key document, and the sort of throwing down of the gauntlet of, here we are, there's now going to be a United States, and this is the ends of our experiment. The Constitution would come later and be the means, right? The operational instructions as to how this would work. But it's the Declaration in which our founding ideals are set. But remember, that was thrown together quickly in the middle of a conflict and in a crisis. And while those words were there to be purposed, and indeed, you have the little free electrons of moments like Washington talking about that, and other speeches and articulations, but it was still not congealed in any sense. If you'd asked people, in the aftermath of the revolution in the early republic, what country are you from? They would have said, I'm from Massachusetts, I'm from South Carolina, I'm from Virginia. The idea of being an American, except in the sense that an English person or a German person or a French person at the time would have said, were Europeans. Being an American was to distinguish yourself against being a European or somebody from Asia or somewhere else. You collectively had that identity, but that wasn't your country, and they didn't exactly mean the United States, right? The United States, any idea of exactly what it was supposed to be was still in confusion. Even 2 constitutions along, there were all these worries. After the Articles of Confederation, our first constitution was created, many of the founders were worried that in the absence of a stronger central government, that all of these different component groups of states and former colonies would soon end up at war with one another. Comparisons to the warring statelets of ancient Greece, and many of the observers of the United States at the time, like British spies and others who were watching the United States and trying to figure out what would happen with these colonies, were almost certain that it would break into at least 3 competing confederations, because the people of the different colonies didn't see eye to eye on anything. That was one of my previous books, American Nations, told that exact story, right? That there's never been one America, but rather several Americas, because of the differences between the colonies being so profound, right? They were each founded by people with different ethnographic and religious and political characteristics. The New England colonies were very different from the Dutch founded area around New York City, from the Appalachian backcountry, from the lowlands of the Deep South, and so on. And that they were often enemies in the colonial period, not friends and competitors. And suddenly they found themselves all inside this, because they'd faced a shared threat from British colonial policy. And lo and behold, they'd won. They found themselves in this thing called the United States together. So what it was that held them together, other than the shared struggle of the revolution, was still unclear. When they even people sat down to write histories in that period, no one tried to write a history of America or the United States. They were writing in the early republic the history of Connecticut, the history of South Carolina. Those were the nations by and large. The United States was, is it a European Union? What is it? Nobody was really quite certain.
Yeah. Although you do, one of the, and I should point out that what you've done in this book is sort of told the story of that intellectual battle through the lives of 5 characters. And the first character you introduce, George Bancroft, actually did aspire to sort of coming up with the history of the country, and yet it was, very much his own point of view. Why don't you very quickly sort of take us through, so you tell the kind of the contrasting, the conflicting ideas about what America stood for through the ideas of these 5 characters. Why don't you very quickly introduce these 5 characters? I mentioned George Bancroft, but take us through all 5 very quickly.
Yeah, so George Bancroft, who became a historian and a statesman, he was probably the most influential historian of the 19th century. He was born in 1800 and lived through almost the entire century into the 1890s. And in the course of it, he ended up being the first person to package and put forward a version of our civic national answer to what the United States is. The answer that what makes America America and its purpose is fealty to the ideas in the Declaration of Independence, just as you said, in the inherent equality of humans, in their unalienable rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and consensual self-government. That was the mission and the purpose. We might not necessarily share a past, but we shared what he thought was actually a destiny, a God-given destiny. He thought that essentially God and Providence had chosen the United States long ago to fulfill this purpose of carrying the baton of human freedom forward into history and across a continent. And that we had been sort of seeded to do that. And while South Carolina and Virginia and New Hampshire might appear to have had very different histories, in fact, there was a divine plan the whole time that identical seeds were planted in all these places to come to fruition in the United States. And that
Speaking of South Carolina,
what's that?
Speaking of South Carolina, second character.
And the second character was a contemporary of his, William Gilmore Simms, who was, Bancroft was from Massachusetts, Simms was from Charleston, and he's forgotten now, but he was the leading man of letters of the antebellum South and the Confederacy, and a novelist, a best-selling novelist whose works were read in the antebellum period across the Federation, enormously popular and influential. And he said, no, Bancroft is totally wrong. In fact, explicitly that Jefferson was wrong when he wrote those words in the Declaration of Independence, that it's patently absurd that humans are created equally, they clearly are not, and that what really defines the United States is that it is a homeland, or more appropriately, a set of homelands of organic nations like South Carolina and Massachusetts that all share the fact that they are the proper homeland of the allegedly superior Anglo-Saxon race, and that it's the Anglo-Saxon race and its qualities which allowed these particular peoples to achieve and have these ideals of self-government for themselves, who are uniquely qualified to do this, that's what defines the United States. In other words, he provided an ethnic definition to who's American and who is not American, one that could allow for, and in fact encourage, the existence of servitude and slavery, a model on the classical Republican tradition of like ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which were slave states.
Yeah, and then quite a contrast with the vision of Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass is a little bit younger than Sims and Bancroft, and he's the pivotal figure in the book because he takes that civic national tradition, that idea that America is about these ideals. And unlike Bancroft, who believed that God had this plan, we all needed to sit back, and America was destined to achieve these things, Douglass, as a fugitive, who had escaped from slavery, knew firsthand and could articulate firsthand just how far America was from achieving any of those ideals. But he believed in them. He essentially argued, America, you need to actually come to grips and make these ideals a reality. And through his speeches, and he was discovered as the Underground Railway, after he escaped from Maryland, brought him to New Bedford, and he was a day laborer there when he was discovered by the abolitionists. And they discovered he not only had this incredible firsthand story to tell, but he was a remarkably gifted orator and then writer. And they put him on the speaking circuit, and he became a national and then an international celebrity. And his voice in arguing for these things, arguing them to Lincoln in personal meetings during the Civil War, arguing them during the long and terrible end of Reconstruction and the rise of the Redeemer regimes and the Ku Klux Klan. He writes and provides a versions and documented versions of what our civic myth could be, that probably written as well as anybody ever has, and becomes this pivotal figure, confronting the difference between our ideals and what we have and haven't achieved.
I want to quote just from one of them, because it's just amazing to read these words today, 150 years later or whatever, and to see how relevant they are. He talked about establishing a nation for all who seek our shelter, whether from Asia, Africa, or the Isles of the Sea. We shall mold them all, each after his kind, into Americans, Indian and Celt, Indian and Celt, Negro and Saxon, Latin and Teuton, Mongolian and Caucasian, Jew and Gentile, all shall here bow to the same law, speak the same language, support the same government, enjoy the same liberty, vibrate with the same national enthusiasm, and seek the same national ends. Really quite an extraordinary version. And of the five, the only one that was able to articulate that.
Yeah, and fought for it. And he was an ally to he knew personally Susan B. Anthony, and was an ally to the women's movement, and spoke at the Seneca Convention. I mean, he took these values to heart and fought for all sorts of oppressed people. He ended up, when he was on international tour, actually to escape the possibility of being killed or captured in the United States in the 1850s, he went to Ireland and England on a speaking tour. And when in Ireland, he ended up there just as the famine was breaking in Ireland, his championing of the Irish cause to English audiences. I mean, he was deeply imbued in this civic tradition for everybody, and argued forcefully for it throughout his long life.
Okay, quickly, the final two characters.
Right. So then, as you move on into the post-Civil War period, you start encountering these two other pivotal characters who were children during the Civil War itself. One of them is Woodrow Wilson, and if it's said that the South lost the war but won the peace, it's the Woodrow Wilson winning the election and coming to the White House that is the crowning moment for that, because Woodrow Wilson was raised in the Deep South. His father was the leading figure in the Presbyterian Church of the Confederacy, author of a famous pamphlet on how slavery is ordained by God. And Woodrow Wilson came from a deeply white supremacist ethno-nationalist tradition. And when he arrived in the White House, this was not entirely understood on the campaign trail. But once he reached the White House, he presided over the segregation of the Union government, of the federal government that had won the Civil War, with a cabinet that was largely also drawn from the Deep South. And when the first blockbuster American film, the film that created Hollywood, A Birth of a Nation, appeared in 1915, there were massive street protests across the country, police facing off against hundreds and sometimes thousands of protesters trying to stop this film from being screened because it celebrates the Ku Klux Klan's reign of terror to reverse the political emancipation of African Americans in the South. I mean, it's a horrific film which it's a silent film, so it contained placards at different times quoting Woodrow Wilson's own history of the United States to footnote some of the most appalling things in the film. Because Woodrow Wilson was a good friend and graduate school classmate of the co-producer of the film and the man whose novel the film was based on, Thomas Dixon Jr. And when the film was in trouble, right, this is a film that cost more than Avatar and Lord of the Rings combined, if you adjust it for the time period. And at that time, the First Amendment was not yet understood by the courts to cover artistic productions. So cities and states regularly censored films and dramatic productions that were considered to be somehow dangerous to public morals. And the threat was that major cities would do exactly that to Birth of a Nation, effectively bankrupting the producers in the film. But Dixon went to Woodrow Wilson, who screened it in the White House before the cabinet, a moment that was pivotal to shifting the atmosphere and the decision calculus of mayors and governors across the country. And then the next morning, the Supreme Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice White, whose statue is now being considered for being toppled in Louisiana, he also showed the film agreed to show the film for the other justices and leaders of Congress at the finest ballroom in Washington, D.C., because he'd been in the Ku Klux Klan and thought the film was just wonderful. So this is just illustrates a bit of how in the 1910s and 1920s, this ethno-nationalist, white supremacist definition of the United States wasn't just a fringe thing, it was the dominant consensus view across the Federation and had captured the White House without much of a protest and was infusing into popular culture, where Birth of a Nation literally inspired the second Ku Klux Klan into being.
And it's amazing, isn't it, that Woodrow Wilson has managed to have this reputation as a peacemaker. There's a big think tank in Washington called the Woodrow Wilson Center that, you would not know, if you didn't know the history of Wilson's presidency, you would not know what a racist and really vile man he was if you just sort of look at all the places that are named after him.
I know, it's stunning to me that because this isn't like hidden history, it's right there in the letters and in the newspaper accounts of the time. What blows me away is that would have taken generations of biographers just kind of covering it up in a sense. I mean, it is so over the top, even for its time period. It's just amazing that his reputation was as an idealist, and it extended into his foreign policy too.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into sort of bring this up to the present day, but we have one sort of alternative idea of what America stands for with Frederick Jackson Turner. I want you very quickly, because this is what it seems to me that you talked earlier about your American Nations book, and I wondered if you sort of took some inspiration from Frederick Jackson Turner, because he had a somewhat similar sort of view of what America was all about, right?
It turned out he did, but I must confess, until I started researching this book, I had no idea that Frederick Jackson Turner, after he wrote his famous frontier thesis, right, that he's the historian of sort of the end of the 19th and the early decades of the 20th century, who said, no, what makes America America doesn't have anything to do with North and South and European colonization. It has to do with my region, the Midwest, that when settlers came across the Appalachian Mountains into the Midwest and West, they finally were free from all the neo-feudal baggage of old world history that still infected the East Coast. They entered this imagined Garden of Eden where they could get back to their true and natural state unlike anybody else, in the world, and that this allowed them to rediscover their fundamental Republican virtues of self-governance and, mutual respect and civic involvement, and that this forged Americans and made Americans what they are. And it was also basically taking that, essentially optimistic and potentially universal promise of the Declaration of Independence and the civic national tradition that Bancroft had, but swapping out God being involved with rather the science that was then the rage, which was the Darwinian science, and he was looking at it from natural selection. He thought that human societies also would adapt to their natural environment, and as these settlers from these different places all came to the frontier, they were all together shaped to adapt to the conditions in the frontier and become supposedly good Democrats. But what he realized shortly after releasing that essay, that, oh my gosh, the data doesn't support that, right? Because he was a procrastinator. He only wrote essentially one book in his whole career because he loved research. I have another filing cabinet to fill before I can write that essay. And he spent the rest of his life filling cabinets and realizing that it's the difference between the sections. Even though, the sort of New England settlement stream coming from New England across upstate New York and into the Western Reserve of Ohio and the upper Great Lakes states, those people, despite encountering this environment that was broadly similar to the settlers coming from, say, Greater Appalachia, from Virginia and Kentucky, and rafting down the Ohio River and settling the lower part of the lower Great Lakes states, they stubbornly didn't adapt together to become one. In fact, they remained different in almost every way he could look at behavior, political calculus, and he was trying to write his magnum opus about American sections. He wrote essays saying, this is it, history has to be understood through the difference in the regions. And I couldn't believe it, because I'd written a book, in 2011 saying all that. I had no idea that Turner had done this, and nobody else did, because, even though he kept talking about this, kind of banging the drum, nobody would listen, because he was like, there's a rock band, and early on they have a #1 hit single that takes on the world, and they go on concert with their new albums, and nobody wants to hear it. They just want to hear the #1 song. He couldn't get any real attention for his sections argument, and so the frontier thesis ran along even after its own author realized, that's not quite it. So
That's amazing, because I was
just amazed by it. Yeah.
Okay, so I said at the beginning, Colin, that the amazing thing to me about your book was how suspenseful it was. I really didn't know where it was going to end. You write in the beginning, I end the story at the point when a broad consensus on how to answer those questions was finally achieved. And I sort of read your book thinking, now, what is going to be that broad consensus? Is it going to be something sort of liberal and humane and universal? Is it going to be something else? And, I published a book 5 years ago about the impact on America of the 1965 Immigration Act, which opened America's doors to immigrants of color for the first time. And, that I have to say that book was sort of presented a somewhat optimistic view of America. I sort of said that actually we have proven that we are able to be a diverse nation. We've demonstrated our resilience. We've sort of lived up to our ideals. That came out in 2015. And I was wondering how you were going to end this book and what you finally would decide was that consensus. And you actually ended in the last few pages on a much darker note.
Yeah, first, Nation of Nations, the book Tom is mentioning, is a fantastic book. I really loved it, and it tells a great deal about how we pivoted away from this first consensus point with the 1965 Immigration Act. But what I wanted to do in the book, the original goal was, figure out where and by whom and when our national story was kind of created and concocted, and carry the story through until it became sort of a dominant tradition. And how did that happen? I did not expect that. I thought the answer would start after the Civil War, when I first started researching, with the effort to draw the country together after this horrible conflict where hundreds of thousands had died, that they must have had to have concocted a myth that would draw South, North, and West together and allow the country to continue. But it turned out that wasn't the case. Those things happened, but there was this whole story starting in the 1830s with the creation of two rival ideas that, define us by bloodlines and race, or define us by our ideals. And as I was going along, realizing that there was this battle from the very beginning of the myth making between these two traditions, it ended up that the Civil War was, of course, the most terrible real world clash of those ideals, but that it continued on through the 19th century. And that in fact, when finally one tradition won, it wasn't that ideals based civic national tradition at all, but the ethno-nationalism of Woodrow Wilson. Because yes, in an effort to heal the country together, white Americans essentially agreed to jettison the moral content of the war that Lincoln had put forth in the Gettysburg Address, that this is about meeting our values of the Declaration of Independence and being a truly equal society. That was all jettisoned in favor of, oh, well, everyone fought honorably, and blue and gray, can now hug and intermarry, and isn't that great? And we'll make films like Gone with the Wind. That was the basic deal that was made. And that deal also led to the rival Woodrow Wilson and the sort of reconciliation on, sort of white Americans' terms of a country effectively defined by, Anglo-Saxon Protestant ascendancy by that time period. Skeptical of those new immigrants coming in, be they Catholics or Irish or wherever they were from, Chinese, and the writing of the Immigration Act that predates the one your book was all about, the 1924 one that was explicitly about racial quotas and preventing this Anglo-Saxon United States from changing.
But we'd like to believe that we got past that. We'd like to believe that with the Civil Rights Movement, with the Immigration Act, with things like the Voting Rights Act, with the election of an African-American president, that we really had moved beyond that. But you you leave us kind of thinking that maybe we still are battling these same battles, right?
I mean,
we're
right this moment in the streets, people are fighting these battles over the monuments to people like Justice White and the leaders of the Confederacy, and even people implicated in other ways, Woodrow Wilson, and even people talking about Teddy Roosevelt and starting to examine other figures who are symbols of our past, but also the basic confrontation over Black Lives Matter. Comes down to, are we about, the inherent equality of humans or not, right? It's all that theme that we've been battling and has been our curse in this country, for a very long time, since its inception. I'm optimistic in the sense that old ethno-national triumph in the teens and 20s was itself overthrown in the 1960s by the civil rights movement and the effect of the mobilization of the world wars and the Cold War's threat that the continued existence of an apartheid regime in the United States was becoming a damaging national security threat in a Cold War existential conflict that was being fought by proxy in non-white parts of the world. And it was very hard to make the argument you should side with our country when a diplomat from a newly independent African country would be driven off a beach, outside Washington, D.C., or wouldn't be able to find a restaurant to eat in on the way to a conference, or allowed to check into a hotel. I mean, that was massive Soviet propaganda. So all of those things changed again. And I'm optimistic in the sense that I believe that most Americans, want that civic national tradition, not the ethno-national one. But the latter has not been vanquished and is still with us and has been a great danger today. So, I mean, the battle continues, but maybe this is a moment with the ongoing protests and discussion that we can finally seize to sort of set this right and rediscover those shared purposes, which essentially balkanized federation like the United States absolutely has to have this kind of national story if it's going to hold together and continue to exist in the medium and long term. And this is giving us a great opportunity to revisit those things and update them and do exactly that, because humans need a story of belonging if they're going to believe themselves to belong to something as abstract as a nation, regardless of what nation that is, and the United States especially so.
Well, I think that America is unique in that regard, in that it's sort of we've been living this experiment for 250 years. And, the nature of an experiment is you don't know if it's going to work or not. I mean, I remember that one thing in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he said, we were a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that we're all created equal. The proposition that people don't pay enough attention to that word proposition. It was not proven. A proposition has to be proved. And America, as I say, has been sort of what you tell so beautifully in this story is that this is this long story of America sort of living this experiment of what it means to create a nation sort of out of such disparate elements.
And maybe the first nation to try to create it, not with a ethnic definition and
Right.
argument that all French people, despite the fact that today's France is completely different dialects and totally different peoples, we're all in fact French, and we're now a French nation. That was a much harder argument to make in the United States. So we were sort of the first maybe artificial nation where we had a state first, the United States, and then had to come up with a story as to why we existed. Other countries have done that since, but this was a remarkable proposition for a country to have to do at the same time that it was articulating what were, revolutionary and inspiring ideals in the Declaration of Independence. So yeah, absolutely. And it's been like any experiment, there've been terrible mistakes. Humans in general haven't been doing this, liberal democracy thing where you try to create a society where individuals can be as free as possible. That idea is just a conception. It's only a few centuries old, and it took us thousands of years to even get to the point where someone would articulate such an idea. And through our experimentation since, we fail as often as we succeed. It's a hard thing to do, and the experiment continues in the United States and elsewhere in the world today.
All right. So Tom promised in the beginning, the other Tom, that some of our viewers will have a chance to weigh in here. I've got some open questions that have come in, and this is for those of you who haven't posed a question yet. This is the opportunity. Let me just start out with this one, Colin, because it's a nice one to start out with. Just finished American Nations last night. Thank you for such insight. I have a lot of catching up to do regarding your other books, and somebody else wrote. If I can bring this back up, you've written 3 excellent looking books about this nation, American Character, American Nations and Union. Do you recommend reading these in any particular order?
Well,
couple of softballs to start it out.
I wrote them in that order, and I personally can think of them as sort of a trilogy. So I would, in fact, read them in that order if you want to read all 3. American Nations sets out the existential fundamental character of the country as being divided and what that's meant for our history. American Character looks at how do you protect a liberal democracy in general, and ours in particular, given this. And Union, and we've been discussing today about how we came up with a story that held us together. And the implication in it is that there are building blocks and lessons in it for us to revive that story today.
Okay, Colin, here's a couple more. This one is an anonymous. Those were anonymous as well. This person writes, I spent 7 months in the Deep South in 2019. I had to ask myself, could the Deep South keep its culture if it did wholeheartedly embrace Black Lives Matter? In other words, tearing down statues of Confederate soldiers, police reforms, etc., putting Black American leaders in political power, systematic racial equality. Or do you think that the culture of the South, and because you have this kind of regional perspective on America's character, what would it mean for the culture of the South to really embrace a culture of equality? Would you say?
Well, in American Nations, I argue that what we think of as the South, there's really 3 Souths, and some of them extend into what we think of as the North and the like. There's the Deep South, which is what I think we're talking about here, is the lowlands. Sometimes it used to be called the Cotton South instead of the Tobacco South or the uplands, but it's the lowland parts of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, extending into eastern Texas and up the Mississippi, up as far as Memphis. And it's a sprawling area, and what it shares is that it was originally founded, not by New England Puritans or, commercial-minded Dutch people or the lesser sons of English gentry who were going to the Tidewater to try to rebuild, Downton Abbey style, society in the American wilderness. The Deep South was founded via the West Indies by English slave lords from Barbados. It was a fully formed slave society from the moment that the first founding colonizers showed up in South Carolina, and the culture they created and the economic system they modeled that spread was based on, extreme oligarchy and inequality, right? It was that classical republicanism of William Gilmore Simms, that a small group of people have the skills and characteristics to properly govern themselves and govern others, and they should be allowed to do so. And so that society and those fundamental things they're very powerful, and in liberal democratic terms, destructive things to have at the core of a culture's deep historical DNA. Now, you can absolutely change what you want to celebrate, and societies and nations can change. I don't live in the Deep South, so I'm probably not the best person to predict how that would be accomplished and how difficult it would be today to do those things. But I know the big challenge is that those things run so deep into the way government is organized and the idea of public investment or the purpose of government itself, and its long history of inequality and enormous gulfs between haves and have-nots. Do I think that those things could be overcome, and that there are tons of people in the Deep South who have spent their lives wishing to do so and building on that? Absolutely. Just in terms of why it's so challenging, it's this backstory. Societies do change, and I'd imagine the Deep South can. Getting rid of your Confederate monuments, well, is not something that should be that necessarily difficult to accomplish or change your culture. You're deciding not to purge your history, but to decide which parts of it you want to celebrate.
And one of the most interesting new developments in that regard is in Mississippi, where you have even the Republican leadership in the Mississippi legislature now really seemingly fully on board with changing the flag of Mississippi to get rid of the Confederate battle flag symbol.
Absolutely, and you're seeing, Chief Justice White's statue, which there's one both. I think it's at the state Capitol building, I think, and I think there's another one in the U.S. Capitol. They're talking about finally removing that as well. But beyond that, you also run into those deeper things. I mean, right now with the pandemic response, the idea of individual liberty and the common good in an oligarchic system, to the winner go the spoils, runs deep. And we're seeing in something like a pandemic response where individual liberty can be really bad for the common good if you're worried about whether or not to implement public health expert advice. And now we're seeing on a regional basis how big the public policy outcomes can be, and how big the difference is between what political leaders are embracing. So that's the other side of the legacy, is those deeper things that affect profound events.
Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
Here's another interesting question. The USA has the second largest population of Spanish speakers out of any country on earth, behind Mexico. Actually, I didn't know that. It's amazing. Some believe it will surpass Mexico itself by 2050, along with a white minority in the population on this side. Is Spanish as a second official language possible in the USA in the next 100 years, or at least mandating Spanish language studies across the board in public American education? Behind this, Colin, is this question of, we can't really establish this kind of immutable idea of American nationality when the makeup of our population is changing sort of so constantly, is it? What does that imply? I mean, this listener is wondering, with respect to the growing Spanish language population, but what does it imply in terms of, what America is?
I mean, in American nations, that essentially argues that these fundamental cultural characteristics that are so different between the regions, that those have sort of survived in the sort of ethos and cultural assumptions, and is the thing that other immigrant groups confront when they arrive. That if you come later, you end up confronting this, and your children or grandchildren may assimilate into the culture around them, but it's a regional culture assimilating into not an American one, because there's not one broad American culture. There's a greater New England one and a greater Appalachian one, and one in what I called El Norte in the book, which is the area that was originally colonized by New Spain as the south to north project of the vast Spanish Empire. And each of these places has different cultural assumptions, and that anybody theoretically can become a member of those societies, or of the United States, with the parentheses that you're really assimilating regionally. But it takes a generation or two. So theoretically, can the United States have any given immigrant group comes in an enormous number? Is that going to fundamentally change the country and make it impossible to govern? People have been worrying about that with every major immigration wave since the Scots-Irish started coming in the 1730s and onwards. And it hasn't. The United States has a great ability to both assimilate and have this sort of dynamism, in part because it has multiple regions, but also, because there's not really an ethnographic definition to the United States. Theoretically, there's not a language definition either, but it is convenient for a continent-spanning country to at least share one official language everywhere, whatever language that is, just as a practical matter. But why that? I don't see that a large immigration from Mexico or anywhere else in any particular period is really, in the medium or long term, some great threat, because countries experience these waves at all times. So
So you said earlier on, Colin, that you'd like, if people are going to read all your books, you'd like them to be read in the order in which they were written. Dan Gordon wants to know if this new book, Union, represents an evolution or a correction or a change in your thinking about American identity since you wrote American Nations. Our thinking always evolves, obviously, with more thought we put into our thinking. Circumstances have changed. So would you say that this new book does represent an evolution in your own thinking in any way?
I've learned a lot of things while researching this book, for sure, but it didn't fundamentally change or contradict or shift my thoughts from American Nations. It complements them. American Nations says, this is what the true fundamental characteristics of our federation are. Union asked the question, given that, how did we ever get convinced of something else, and by whom and how? And so that latter question is the blanket thrown over American Nations, and understanding the interplay of those two things is pretty much essential. So I'd say it's just taking something that existed by implication from American Nations and actually writing a book and fleshing out that part as well.
So nobody is really pushing back against your arguments here, Colin, but Carolyn Poplin wants you to talk about the example of World War II, where the Americans and American allies came together to challenge a fundamentally racist regime, a regime, Nazi Germany, built on deeply racist ideology. We came together to fight it as an existential threat. I think that what Carolyn is saying is, doesn't that, in a sense, sort of counterpose to the kind of the darker idea that somehow we as a nation were committed to, we were ourselves committed to kind of a ethno-nationalist vision?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, but both in World War I and World War II, go no further than to look at the experience of, say, African-American soldiers fighting in those wars, particularly those serving under white Southern officers. That's part of the backstory to how things changed in the 1960s, is the return of so many servicemen from war, African-American servicemen, who'd experienced both, the rigid, white supremacist attitudes and behavior from white officers when they were serving in Europe or Japan, but had also experienced, whether they were being deployed through England to then land at D-Day, or through Hawaii to go fight in the Trans-Pacific War and the amphibious landings across the Carolines and the Marshalls, whichever it was, in both Hawaii and England, they encountered environments that were where people were treating them much more nearly as full humans. There wasn't the, you can't come in here and eat in our restaurant or sit here, and there weren't those attitudes. In France, the French civilian population during the invasion of France was treating, people of other races quite equally. They saw the difference in even the behavior of officers of British colonial troops they were serving behind from African countries and other countries that, while obviously paternalistic, was not at all the same as they were being treated by their Southern officers. So I would say that the implications, the dissonance between fighting the Nazi regime and what the Nazis stood for, and the existence, the realities of the Jim Crow South, and to certainly plenty extent, in less formal terms, the rest of the country, and the way that the US military was actually organized with segregated units, all of that only emphasized the gulf between American ideals and American practice. And I think it's not my area of expertise, but I think it's pretty well documented in the history of the civil rights movement that it's the returning troops from in both waves, but especially after World War II, that end up very much providing an impetus to start trying to challenge the Jim Crow South and white supremacy, first in the South, but then everywhere in the country.
Right. And speaking of sort of what the current national conversation is about, one anonymous attendee asks you this question: should we worry that identity politics will be detrimental to American exceptionalism and the other values we were founded on? This attendee describes himself or herself as a first-generation immigrant who assimilated enthusiastically, but is concerned that newer immigrants and others may not be assimilating as enthusiastically. Are there lessons here sort of for how we approach our own differences now, the extent to which we focus on them, as opposed to try to build a sort of a national composite nationality? Is that maybe a kind of a risky thing to try to do? And I know that there are some people who would argue that to the extent that you try to build a composite nationality in the way that Frederick Douglass talked about it, what you get is a nationality that simply reflects the dominant interests of the culture and not a truly composite nationality.
I mean, it's a really complex question, particularly in US history. I mean, I think what I can offer most intelligently is that once you go beyond the level of union, talking about what our shared ideals that are supposed to hold us all together are in our story of nationhood, the reality on the ground historically has been that the way each regional culture defines itself and defines what an immigrant coming in, how they belong or should belong, or what the ideal is, are very different, and that only adds to the complexity of our country. So for much of the history of 19th and early 20th century immigration in greater New England, and the areas that New Englanders and their descendants were the first colonizers of, it was the argument that it's a melting pot, right? That everyone comes and becomes like us, right? Henry Ford had it as plants, these special classes to assimilate workers arriving from other strange parts of the world, so that they would all become Americans. They took special classes to dress right and eat the food this way and talk this way, and don't wear those clothes, wear these clothes. And at the end, they had a graduation ceremony with a giant paper mache pot that was 2 stories tall, and their teachers were stirring the pot with from a high up on a scaffolding, as the graduating students, each wearing their national costumes of Serbia or wherever it was, walked into the pot and then changed into identical American suits, right? So it's assimilation. You can come here, but you must become like us. Whereas by contrast, in the tier of the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic states that had its origins with the Quaker experiment in the Delaware Bay colonies, William Penn in Philadelphia and the surrounding colonies, and its extension westward, had a completely different model that were a mosaic, that you can have many peoples bringing their culture, living side by side, almost checkerboard fashion, where a given city could have a neighborhood where suddenly in the neighborhood everybody is speaking, this, variety of Romanian from these foothills, and have their own church from that area and their own newspaper and their own schools. And then the next neighborhood, everyone's from, this tiny island in the middle of the Pacific and all the same things. Or out on the Iowa plains, that you'd have one farming village that's everyone's Danish, and the next farming village, everyone's from this German Pietist sect, and they all have their own thing, and that's completely fine, and no one group is in charge. Many cultures living side by side as one. Those are completely opposite ideas of what immigration should be, and in a sense, what America should be. And in other parts of the country, immigration itself was seen as strange. There were very few immigrants who came into the Deep South or Tidewater or Greater Appalachia in the late 19th and early 20th century, because there was nothing to attract people leaving a land-starved neo-feudal environment in Europe to go to places that had those same characteristics in the United States. So that meant that the experience of an absence of substantial immigration from the outside world in some regions itself shaped the character and sort of the assumptions that people had about what's American and what's normal. So what I'm saying is there's no easy answer to that, because our federation is so divided regionally, even in the assumptions about that part of things. Yes. Now, the ideal, if we accept the civic national ideal, then it should be open to, everybody, and, how that plays out in practice with the different regions' historical attitudes, that's the fairly complicated question. I don't think I have an answer for off the top of my head.
Well, I do know that some of the people that are most suspicious of any effort to create a national identity are the ones that sort of feel most marginalized to begin with. And, they would quite understandably have a concern that, that their character, their identity, would not be reflected in that new sort of national identity. And I think that's actually a conversation we're having with a great deal of passion and intensity right now. A couple more questions, Colin, that are actually very similar. One is whether you think that Hollywood, sort of the entertainment industry, I guess you could say, has played a role in creating sort of some sense of nationhood. Another listener wants to know if you think that sports have played any kind of analogous role in that regard.
I mean, Hollywood definitely, as an incredibly powerful, popular medium for disseminating ideas and values and symbols. It's been huge, from Birth of a Nation kicking it off in a really bad way to all sorts of films with different arguments about what is American and what isn't, and throughout different times in history, the shifting of how different groups of people are portrayed, what's considered the good behavior of the heroes and what's the bad and suspicious behavior of the villains. Absolutely, those are extremely powerful cultural forces. And movies, and now their current form as the grand television series that we see in Netflix and Amazon Prime and all those other outlets are massive cultural forces that are, back when I was writing Union, the battle over ideas was conducted in speeches that were then published by newspapers, and then another newspaper would get a copy of that one and retweet it by republishing it, and then books would be created. And it was, the argument was speeches and books and the written word. Today, it's lots of things, and film is one of the most powerful medium and has been for a long time. But the messages, aren't by any means does Hollywood project, one message at any one time.
I think we have to wrap it up pretty soon, momentarily here, Colin, but just to kind of close off, a couple more questions about Woodrow Wilson. And I'm not surprised, as I say, because Woodrow Wilson, the controversy around Woodrow Wilson is very much in the news right now. And one person wants to know if you think that that your book, I don't know how many people have read it yet, so it's kind of far, yes, but whether your book had any role to play in the decision of authorities at Princeton to sort of remove Wilson's name from one of the colleges. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe you've already had an input. Also, a question from your uncle Michael.
Excellent.
New Hampshire, who wonders whether there was a sort of overt or covert attempt to keep Woodrow Wilson's white supremacy views and actions sort of hidden and not exposed to the public culture. So again, I think this is really interesting, sort of all of a sudden this new attention on Woodrow Wilson. What's your final thought on Woodrow Wilson?
I'd love to claim that my book pushed Princeton to do so, and if they'd read it, it would have pushed them. I don't think the book's been out long enough where I can make a claim. Right. Thank you, Uncle Michael, for that question. It is stunning that Woodrow Wilson's reputation has remained as unsullied as it has, because all of this stuff is hiding in plain sight. I mean, the information is not concealed, but many people telling Wilson's story for decades have managed to dodge or avoid the implications of it in a way that in some cases it's hard to believe, given that I know the sources that they looked at and what the sources say in context. It's hard to believe there wasn't some intentional effort to buff up his reputation as a great president, et cetera, and not really confront what one was looking at. Maybe not conspiratorial, but people are like that, and sometimes writing hagiographies instead of really, telling the truth about what they're finding about a figure who has a lofty, if perhaps unearned, reputation.
Okay, Colin, this is, as I said at the beginning, is a fascinating book, really a great read. You made the comparison to a novel. I would certainly endorse that. I said it was suspenseful. And you can see all my post-it notes on here. The story is Union, the struggle to forge the story of the United States nationhood. It's been a real treat to talk to you, Colin. Really interesting conversation, and good luck with your book.
Thank you. And thank you, Tom, so much for doing this, and also to Politics and Prose for hosting this. I wish I could have been in the store again in person, but we'll hand it over to Politics and Prose. Buy local, as they say, or if you don't live in DC, don't buy local, and help Politics and Prose out by purchasing Union or even Tom's book on Nation of Nations today.
All right, Tom from Politics and Prose, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thank you so much, Colin and Tom. I really appreciate that conversation. It was incredible. I think we all learned a lot. There is a link in the chat for anyone who wants to purchase the book. And again, we highly recommend that. You can click there and it'll take you to Politics and Prose's website. And thank you again so much, and everyone. And we'll see you next time on Politics and Prose Live.
Thank you.
Thank you.